President and all you fellows, and particularly the new fellows who perhaps didn't want to come to this lecture but felt they had to be inaugurated. Thank you all very much for hearing me talk about the Survey of London. In doing so, I'm representing a small team of about 6 of us, several of whom I'm very grateful are going to be here, and I hope they and you will contribute to a discussion afterwards, because I have really constructed this talk as half kind of general information about the survey, half asking some questions and setting out some problems and issues which I think we face. And really, I regard it as an occasion among friends, if I may put it, friends and colleagues, to talk about the survey and indeed large historical institutions of the survey's kind and the kind of problems and positions they're in these days. I've put this 17th century German engraving on because actually I think it's going to be the last lecture I give as the editor. I'm stepping down this summer, having done it for 9 years, wonderful, enjoyable years they've been for me, and it's been a fantastic tradition. So I also mean, I feel I can say exactly what I think without fear or favour. Am I shouting too much?
You're okay.
I'm okay? Okay. So, putting it down a little bit, see if that's better. I'll try not to move around too much. If I do, will you all shout and tell me? Anyhow, one animal is not quite enough. We're going to have some more. These are the other animals I thought I would show you, because this represents the fact that a few years ago, when the survey was under English Heritage, and we were doing, as we felt, quite well, I rather arrogantly wrote a paper for the Society of Architectural Historians newsletter, in which I said that there were kind of 3 large circus animals. In fact, I think I used the metaphor troops of animals. I'm using the elephants here as of institutions which produce enormous, big, collective histories of British architecture and topography. One being the VCH, the second being the late Royal Commission Historical Monument Historical of England series, and the third being the survey. And I thought we could do a lot worse than just bashing quickly through these and seeing them in relationship to one another. Better try a bit tactful about what I say. The VCH, of course, still goes strong. It's very interesting. It was founded at exactly the same time as the Survey of London, around about the turn of the 19th and 20th century. And one of the founders was both was Lawrence Gone, whose face you'll see a little bit further on. There you see, rather interesting, the counties in which the VCH reckons to be active and inactive. I always think poor old Northumberland, nobody ever quite got started with Northumberland. But one of the most interesting, and as most of you will know, impressive and respected series for the VCH is indeed the VCH for Middlesex. It's immensely varied from area to area. VCH for Surrey is pretty dead, dare I say it. The VCH for Middlesex is finished. And the ironic thing about that, by the wonderful Christopher Elrington, who you see in the picture on the right, so the effective editor, died a few years ago, as many of you will know. The map there ignores London, which is rather interesting, because it doesn't exist, which is very VCH in a way. But there is a VCH for London, as many of you will know, which Elizabeth Williamson and others have tried to get going. That's a bit frictional in a way, because the survey was there first in London, and there have been moments where I've wanted to say to the VCH, get off our lawn with your tanks, as it were. But in effect, we have very friendly relationships and deal with things in different ways. But the VCH, like all these organisations, has had its funding problems, as I'm sure you all know, and there is a fund which was set up by Christopher Elrington to try and help that along a bit. And others here can probably say how that's getting along. The Royal Commission's inventory series, I'm sorry that the picture on the top is rather out of focus, that's my bad copying work, is as now dead as indeed is the Royal Commission itself. And it's not quite easy to find people who think it was a bit of a disappointing series in many ways, but looking back at it, I think it did some remarkable work in its way of recording and inventorising historic buildings. And particularly I want to emphasise the fact its tradition of measured drawings was so beautiful and fantastic in many ways. And that those volumes, which many of you will have on your shelves, are a remarkable treasure. Of course, the Royal Commission, before it was wound up and brought into English Heritage in, I think, 1999, decided to dispense with the inventory series and go in its wisdom for shorter books on all sorts of different topics. And I think one of the things at the Survey of London we feel is it's very important to keep your focus with these enormous series, to know what you believe you're doing and to keep at it. Nevertheless, I want to ask your advice and thoughts about what we do as we go along. So the Royal Commission, in a way, is a fascinating series, but also a warning of what can happen. And then there is us, as it were, the survey. And Madam President referred to the fact that the late Harry Houdini and the Survey of London have something in common, which is that they've escaped from lots of tricky institutional situations, but we're still going 50 parish volumes and 18 monographs later. And it's pretty astonishing when you look at that record of institutional change in one way or another, that this is the case. And I think it's largely because the people who are actually running the show, as opposed to the people who are paying the piper, have felt they knew at any given time what they were about and have kept going. And so, as one of my colleagues said to me the other day, nobody's ever quite dared to shut it down because it seemed to be doing quite well at the time. And one of my policies over the last 9 years, and it's been pretty good, we've not had that much trouble, but the one difficulty when English Heritage felt it couldn't keep going for financial reasons, was to have a big running programme going forward. So you said, look, come on, we've got 2 or 3 volumes in the pipeline, you can't do anything about it yet. So they have to find you a new home at that point. So there are those 3 series, and I will now cease talking about them and talk for the next 20 minutes or so exclusively about the survey's history, which is quite a self-conscious thing. I think in a sense, if we say the Survey of London knows what it's doing, it doesn't mean to say it's always been doing exactly the same thing. And it has a very rich history of self-consciousness, if you like. Hermione Hobhouse, who was the editor under the Royal Commission and in the early days of English Heritage, I think, she wasn't as productive as some of the editors, but she had a very clear sense that the survey had a significant historical tradition. I'm sure she was an FSA, and she produced, with the help of her colleagues, a number of interesting exhibitions and publications, of which you see 3 here, about an exhibition in the middle, and the other 2 are little catalogues, etc., of the work of the survey, mostly interpreting it, I think, quite accurately from an antiquarian perspective. And you can see the series and all slightly different from an antiquarian perspective, from an architectural perspective, as it were, from an urban history perspective, and from a practical conservationist perspective. They're all slightly different, and they all interrelate, and everybody has their own take on it. And I'm going to give you a particular take about the early years of the survey over the next 5 or 10 minutes. It was founded, as you'll see in a second, by the famous C.R. Ashby, architect, art worker, propagandist, socialist, wonderful book and biography written by Alan Crawford, I'm sure many of you will know. And it was founded with very grand intentions in its way. And if you look at the title page of the very first monograph, which came out in 1896, you'll see it has a no-mean subtitle, An Object Lesson in National History. No mucking around, this isn't just an antiquarian study. And the picture on the right, which is obviously Battersea Power Station as it was last year or so, volume 49 and 50, the last parish volumes of the survey we produced were on Battersea, and since then this building, of course, is undergoing radical change. Anyhow, the quotation I want to draw you to the top comes from volume 1 of the survey in 1900 in Ashby's own words. It is there to make nobler and more humanly enjoyable the life of the great city. And for Ashby, humanity was at least as important as antiquarianism or architecture. And this, I think, I want to emphasise, and it becomes very manifest when you look at both the origins of the whole enterprise and at its very first publication. The origins begin with Ashby having gone to work as a young man at Toynbee Hall, setting up the Guild of Handicrafts at East End, very much one of these things, an educated, Cambridge-educated middle class, upper middle class young people going, as it were, to bring succour to the poor and rough and bedraggled areas of London, and he, of course, starting to do this mainly through setting up the Guild of Handicraft as a way of training young boys in craft work. He felt very strongly that the, as it were, the moral degradation of the East End had a lot to do with the loss of a good architectural and urban environment, and he was incensed by the London School Board's destruction of the old Palace of Bromley by boat for putting an average kind of school boards on the board school on the site, which we would now rather admire probably. And he said, you know, here you could turn an old building like this, which that was thought to be, I think, slightly bogusly at the time, a hunting lodge of King James I or something like that. I forget what the myth of it all is. This could be a great school in which to teach young people of the East End. Why pull it down and put up a modern building when you've got the whole history of the East End in that building? And so he was very angry about this and got together with his young friends, young architects and antiquarians and so forth, to start a series or a register of the worthwhile buildings of London. Of course, in a background when there was absolutely no statutory protection at all. And they hadn't got very far into compiling this register, beginning with the East End where he worked, when he discovered that the Trinity Hospital on the Mile End Road, which is still there, was under threat. So that became both a preservation campaign and the subject of the first monograph of the survey. And there you see the most fascinating to me perspective of the Trinity Hospital in the Mile End Road as it was at the time. Now if you go down today, you'll see there are some rather bedraggled looking slab blocks of the 1960s behind. But for Ashby that would be the same kind of moral, which is you have a kind of an enclave which is architecturally worthwhile and socially worthwhile, sort of offering an object lesson, if you like, to use his own phrase, to the East End, to London, of how people used to be to care for old people and the kind of architecture, the worthwhile architecture that was carried out in, against a background of rubbish and grot, and in his case, Victorian artisan housing behind. And you see that the Matthew Garbett, who's done that perspective for him, has put in little scenes of East End life in the front, you know, costermonger, barrow, a few rotten old cabbages being sold from a stall, that kind of thing, to contrast, to give context to this building. So moral lessons and context are at least as important to Ashby as the actual architecture itself, although he's very keen to record it. And of course it has to be said, so effective was his campaign that the building was retained and is there to this day. Here, just for fun, are some of the illustrations in that first monograph, some old sea captains, because that was who the hospital was for, playing drafts with a copy of the Mercantile Gazette in front of them, perspective by Joseph Purnell, and a dog enjoying himself around the statue of some benefactor or another, with a sea captain having a doze in the background. So it's all quite relaxed stuff, as it were. There's a bit of this as well, but it's not by any means the sole, or indeed perhaps the primary object of Ashby's intent. Now, to give you a little bit more of what I see the kind of interesting ideological background to the survey at that time, I wanted just to take you through the kind of works of four separate bearded gentlemen, as they tend to be. Rather curiously, in the various bits and pieces that have been written about the history of the survey, people often tend to forget there had been a survey of London before by a guy called John Stowe. That's a watercolour by Philip Norman, who was one of the London Survey Committee stalwarts between about 1910 and 1935, on the left of the monument in St Olive's Hart Street, with the first edition of Stowe, 1598 at the bottom, and striped Stowe, as it's called, of the Georgian period, to the right. And I'm sure nearly all of you will know that the whole tone of Stowe is very similar to that which Ashby and his colleagues felt in the 1890s. that London was in a decadent state, that it had, in earlier times, in Stowe's case before the Reformation, been a place where people were looked after and where the architecture and social life went together, but as a result of the wicked influence of the zealous selling off of the monasteries in the Protestant Reformation, it was a very decayed and a downward spiral. So in a way, Ashby is replicating that. I think there's a very self-conscious tradition in which the survey picks up from that. But there are more modern and very interesting parallels, I think, as well, which Ashby would have been well aware of and in some ways was friendly of. I mean, the 1890s and 1900s are astonishing for the wealth of statistical analysis and attention to the social problems in London that were going on. And this is perhaps the most famous of all, Charles Booth's Life and Labour of the People in London, which he began, he was a Tory, it was rather interesting, because he believed that what the socialists were saying about the condition of the poor in London must be an exaggeration. And so he got together with some helpers, in a way not similar from Ashby, except they were sociological people rather than architectural people, to look into all this, starting, of course, with the East End, because that was where, located by almost everybody as the primary area of problems. And this amazing work, which goes on with an amateur committee over something like 10 years, about 20 volumes, much faster than the Survey of London, puts Survey complete shame, and analyses in fascinating detail all the issues and problems. He's very interested in religion, very interested in poverty, very interested in the change in employment. There, for instance, you see a map analysing the number of people in that area of the East End who have been born outside the area. It's a fantastically wonderful set of books, which many of you will know, and some of you will be able to see on the screen there. The second contributor down on the left, Beatrice Potter, is better known to us, of course, as Beatrice Ware. The third guy with a beard I wanted to show to you was a man I mentioned already, which was Lawrence Gom, who really was Ashby's contact with the London County Council. Now, the London County Council, under Gom's leadership to a large degree, wanted to bring together a lot of the knowledge which all these various statistical inquiries were bringing together in London in the 1890s. Gom himself was the statistical officer before he became, as it were, the first servant of the Clerks of Council, the LCC. And he was very interested in history, very interested in folklore. He's the man, among others, who gave Aldwych the name. He identified that area as the area of Saxon London, more or less correctly, it seems. Fascinating all-rounder, and of course the grandfather, I think it was, of the late Andor Gom, the architect and historian, who was there on a ladder putting up a plaque. And Gom basically got the LCC to agree to publish Ashby's rather ramshackle amateurish project and got it on the road. There were quite a lot of friction between them all, but I think it worked out more or less okay in the end. And increasingly, the LCC became a significant player. And the last person in this little group I want to mention isn't so often associated with the survey, and I think it's, to be honest, his practical involvement with it was very slim and short, but did exist, was the famous Patrick Geddes, basically the pioneer of urban sociology. Very difficult chap to pigeonhole, very much a Scot, very puritanical in many ways, but a kind of mover and shaker all over the place, who founded summer schools, for instance, very interested in all ideas of community and student community, and when he got involved in some of the plans for Imperial College London, wanted to set up in London a student hostel in Chelsea on what he thought was the site of Sir Thomas More's house. Rather interesting, said there's the past and the future. Found out that Crosby Hall in the city was going to be pulled down, and got Walter Godfrey, young architect who went to work for the surveyor under Ashby's influence in the 1900s, to actually rebuild Crosby Hall down on the embankment. Now, of course, it's the home of a whiskey millionaire. As usual, London's going down the drain, isn't it? One of the reasons for mentioning Geddes is not only was he a bit of a chum of Ashby's, but he actually was very interested in the concept of the survey. Survey and planning are very fashionable words in these early years. And I emphasise these people because I think the, as it were, the non-antiquarian side of the survey in its early years, its interested in people, is very significant. And so the next picture I put up is one, I'm now stopping talking about late people, I'm talking about somebody who's just about alive and in this room and has got significant initials to show that we've tried to bring back a little bit of the people flavour into the survey in recent years. We're getting Peter Cormack to do some drawings for the Woolwich and Battersea volumes. And this is a picture that I'm sure you can mostly see it as of Powis Street in Woolwich, with people on their mobile telephone, wearing headscarves on their mobile phones, etc., against the background of architecture. So, to some degree, we try and keep these strands together. But on the whole, I think most of you will think of this survey as being about architecture, and indeed that has been primarily its tradition. Once Ashby got slightly bored with it, ran away to Chipping Camden, the LCC and a survey committee had to pick up the pieces to some degree and kept it going in a wonderfully heroic way on very little funding from just after 1900 till 1939. And it's in that period that this tradition of meticulous recording of buildings, not just bits and pieces, which essentially Ashby was doing, elevations and measured drawings like these of the Queen Anne's Gate in a volume of the 1920s, probably most of the work done before the First World War, really gets going. And that is, of course, a mainstay of the tradition today. I don't know how well you can see that drawing, but that's a drawing that Helen Jones, who's on our staff at the moment, has not yet quite completed, of a cutaway through the section of some houses by the Adams in Mansfield Street. Not completed, because an art collector who has not been named hadn't allowed us into the house on the far left. We're hoping we'll be able to fill that in before we publish next year. Anyway, this is these just to give them a second in the sun, because I want to go very fast now, so we can get on to the issues and questions. These are the chaps who kept the survey going in the interwar periods very nobly, and it's in this period maybe it's primarily an antiquarian pursuit. And I just thought I'd represent this by one of the fine measured drawings of that lovely pair of houses on the west side of Lincoln's Inn Fields from quite an early volume. But forwarding pretty fast now till the Second World War, what I haven't really emphasised is that the reason the LCC was interested in the series and wanted to pick it up and publish it, even if it didn't it didn't do the research on the whole for most of these early volumes, was because it wanted a register of worthwhile historic buildings at a period when there was no statutory protection. And therefore, as late as 1950, that's a map from the Bankside volume, you will get only those a few buildings in an area treated. So you're not really dealing with urban history at all. If you then look at a map like the one on the right, which is from volume 37 under the Francis Shepherd era, which we'll come to in a second, which analyses an area of Ladbroke Grove, you'll see it's a totally different approach. It's not about individual buildings, it's about looking at a whole set of buildings, a whole set, an urban area in totality, how it was developed, those are the different builders' takes from the area of Ladbroke Grove 20 years later. So there's a complete revolution, which is possible because the government is taking on, with listing after 1947, the whole business of the statutory protection of buildings. So the survey is freed under Francis Shepherd, who becomes editor in 1954. Very pleased to say he's still alive in his 90s, living in Henley. It's transformed in an extraordinary way into an urban history of London, area by area. So it's totally different, essentially, from what the antiquarian approach had been in the interwar period. Very quickly indeed, because it would take the rest of the evening, this urban history thing is actually quite new. It's remarkable how essentially there wasn't such a thing. If you think there are a few books like people like Brett James in the interwar period about Stuart London, but the looking at London as a whole and analysing the way the architecture and social fabric work together is a post-war thing. The main inspiration, I suppose, is Rasmussen's The Unique City, which was first published in Danish, then published in translated into English in 1937. But I think if you had asked Francis Shepherd what his main inspirations were, he would doubtless have said two men really, and two books. George in London by John Summerson, which everybody owns pretty much. That's deliberately a picture of a dog-eared copy which my mother owned and read from cover to cover, I think. And one picture at the bottom is a less well-known book, which is a Jim Dials's Victorian Suburb. And both these men, and Jim Dials is very much more analytical in his approach to cities, particularly interested in transport, statistics, going into the census, understanding how speculative building worked, and taking Camberwell as the key for his investigations in London. Wonderful man, died alas too young, but a great inspiration to the survey and to Shepherd at that period. This is where I run right fast up to the present. Since the 1954, basically, that's the approach which the survey has taken. A mixed approach of going on with analysing architecture, looking at the way speculative building works, dealing with whole areas, and increasingly dealing with buildings of all types and all centuries. What to leave out? Well, we'll come to that at the end if you like. But here's just a little conspectus of different things which the survey has done since the 50s, just in the most recent years, just also to remind you that it isn't just about parish volumes. There's a monograph there on County Hall. There was a spin-off from the two volumes which the survey did on Poplar, rather heroically under Hermione, going down and tackling the East End after many years of absence. On the whole, most of this work has been done pretty much quietly, without a lot of publicity, without a lot of reviews. People, I think, are too frightened of reviewing the survey. It's too big, really. But we were thrilled last year to get a TLS cover with a very interesting article by Jerry White, but very characteristic of academics, dare I say it, in this assembly. He wanted the survey to have a point of view, which the survey has got a methodology, if you like, but it doesn't particularly have a research question in mind, which academics often think you ought to have. So I think we were pleased by that very complimentary review that Jerry White gave us, but at the same time we felt he didn't entirely get where we were coming from, and perhaps that's a form of arrogance on our part, I don't know. That's where we've got to, more or less. We're now doing bits of Marylebone, Eastern Marylebone, really the Howard de Walden Estate Plus, which isn't on that map, but it shows after 113 years, a little bit more than that, 15 years, we've done about a quarter of London. So we haven't got to the end of the Forth Bridge. We can't talk about repainting it. When people say, redo the Chelsea volume, we say, well, let's just get Stoke Newington and a few places like that done. And we might think, and South East London's a bit embarrassing, but fortunately we did have a go at Woolwich, which you'll see in a moment. And of course, like so many things, our world has been transformed, mainly for good, but not entirely so, by the fact that people now want things online. We are going on producing big, blue volumes which nobody much buys, except in wonderful institutions like the Sargent Antiquaries and the better public libraries, including that at Saffron Walden, where I gave a talk the week before last. I was amazed to see they had a complete set in Saffron Walden Library. But 99%, well, probably 90% of people are now reading these tomes at their desktop free, because English Heritage wonderfully paid for most of the volumes to be digitised, and they're available through the Institute of Historical Research's British History Online series, you see, and my colleague Colin Tom is in charge of that part of our programme. So all but our very most recent volumes of the survey are now available online. Now that's the first half of the talk. For the rest of the talk, I want to, if I've got time, I want to talk about what we think we're up to, why, what are the issues, and what are the questions. I want to preface that by saying I think it's all institutions need to have a sense of what they, I hope I've given that impression, that they know where they're going, they know what they want to do. At the same time, they need to keep their antennae well open. And so I want to ask them, the next question is are we doing a useful job, and who for? It's good that Aileen is doing this, but Aileen herself wrote up the Battersea Arts Centre, before that the Battersea Town Hall, for our survey volume 49, which came out in 2013. Now the reason I'm showing you this picture at this point is because when that awful fire happened, when it was just about a month ago, I somehow thought people might ring us up and say, what's the Survey of London got to say about this? Haven't you got some information to give us? You wrote this wonderful account. Nobody contacted us whatsoever. So it's quite depressing in a way. What the hell are we doing this stuff for? And I think, to start with the negativity, as it were, one thing we're not much used at is for people like architects who are restoring buildings and so forth. We had a plan of that building, didn't we, Aileen? I think we didn't have. It was actually, the fire happened while the building was being restored, and probably one of the reasons it happened, the classic things that often some electrical wires or something, I don't know if they've come to the conclusion yet, the classic problems during a restoration or work happening to a building. But it was mortifying to some degree to think that nobody was interested in contacting us. I think there was more, it wasn't just that the survey's very scholarly and rich account written by Aileen wasn't going to actually help anybody in putting that building back together, or that the pictures we had were no use to them, but actually that was one of the volumes of most recent and wasn't yet online. And therefore, those 95% of people didn't even know we'd written about that yet. When we get that volume online, which we hope to quite soon, then it might be a different thing. But even then, I'm not sure really that's the kind of usefulness that something like the survey can be. Let's come, but who then does use it? Well, it's difficult to say because, of course, most people are actually seeing the thing online already, so most of the time we don't know. It's rather cheering sometimes to go into local public libraries, local reference libraries in London, and to see these dog-eared copies of the survey which the local history librarians get out. In Kensington, they even made their own index of the survey, which is fantastic. It gets used so much. But that won't happen as much now. It's all the Kensington volumes are online. But you do get just a few sort of insights into this from people who come through to us. And I just thought I'd pick up a few ones which have come through to us recently. At the top, Wickham District Council got hold of us because this rather interesting Matthew Brettingham house, which was not very far from here, down in Pall Mall, was demolished in 1908. But the railings, we didn't know this, survived and are in front of Wickham Abbey School in Hyndon. And they wanted to put up one of those modern obelisks outside the gates, saying this is where they come from, and the picture. So they asked us. They're that kind of thing. The picture on the right, not very good image, was just taken by me on Tuesday, where we had a little trot round Whitechapel, which is going to be the next but one area the survey is doing. We're just starting. And Peter Guillory pointed out this house, which rather amusingly was spotted in the past. So an anarchist group has now bought, rather shocking that anarchists should buy a house. wanted to know about its history, especially about the squatting bit. Peter may tell me I got that slightly inaccurate, but that was the story I seem to be hearing there. And then an absolutely standard family history thing, but an interesting example down the bottom, again from the Battersea volumes. Somebody had found those volumes and wanted to know about a whole series of villas, a particular villa on the west side of Clapham Common where her family had lived for some time, and she had some interesting pictures. Okay, it's just a random selection, but I think if there's any moral to be drawn from it is that a lot of the inquiries are not architectural at all. They're mainly historical of one kind or another. And I don't think it should be underemphasised how much it really speaks to ordinary people who just want to know about their street, their family, the past in London in some broader sense. So people who want to be just about architecture, I think, I wouldn't accept that because it seems to be a much richer and wider thing. And on the whole, the inquiries are about the post-war volumes, not about the early ones. That's one thing I thought I would, and who are we writing for? The next thing I thought I might just dwell on is what the survey can do, which on the whole, although there's some fantastically industrious, diligent and impressive scholars, many of them in this room at the moment, there are some things which the survey just has the resources and the time and the patience to do, partly through multidisciplinary working, multi-authorship, which others simply can't do. Stephen Porter has written about the Charter House, but this monograph going through the whole story of the building from the 14th century right through to the 21st written by Philip Temple mainly for our staff, with help from others, of course, is such a thing which I can't conceive can have been done by an individual. And this was a spin-off, as it were, from the Clerkenwell series of the survey. The other thing that's a bit analogous is it can put together all sorts of very, very difficult and piecemeal sources in a way which the lone scholar on the whole can't. This is an example from our current project on Eastern Marylebone, where one of the most famous areas is, of course, Portland Place. And everybody will know that Portland Place was one of the great schemes by the Adams, but even in the 21st century, with all the scholarship that's gone on about Adams, the Portland Place houses have not been analysed, and Colin Tom has been deviling away at this for the last 2 years, getting in the buildings, looking into the Adam papers, looking at what's happened to Portland Place in the 20th century, which of course is to a large degree quite grievous, and producing, with Helen's help, that elevation of a whole Adam set of facades, sort of palace fronts, which doesn't exist anymore and had to be researched in all sorts of complicated ways. And you couldn't expect any individual scholar of the highest merit to do all this without the kind of backing that we have. And I thought I just ought to put on a decent picture of the kind of interiors we're getting now with the help of some excellent photography. Chris Redgrave, who's taken a lot of these pictures, is in the room. I'm very pleased to say we're very proud and pleased with the standard of photography we're now getting. This is looking up the staircase of one of the Adam houses, not in Portland Place, but around the corner from in Mansfield Street. Spin-off. This is where I want to have, if there's time, the second of the films a little bit longer, because I think, because essentially even now we think of ourselves as a public service, however you define public service in the 21st century, we're pleased rather than annoyed when people rip us off, when people produce little books on Kensington and Mayfair, and very highly dependent upon our work. And I'm sure the Buildings of England people would, the present people would say the same. But just to give you an example of spin-off that's been kind of done in-house, I thought I should show you a film which Aileen herself has made about, which came out of doing the Battersea volumes. So let's do this one. I suppose to come back to the boring serious stuff, and thank you very much, Aileen. I think really it's terrific. Every time I see that, I like it more. The kind of thing, the point is, if we don't do the basic boring work with the district surveyor's returns and so forth, you can't get that stuff. Somebody's got to do the basic stuff. And that's our argument for keeping going, and not just doing spin-off, which of course the people who would like us to finance ourselves would like us to do. Okay, just 5 more minutes or so, and think we can wrap up and shift into questions. As we, maybe I've kind of said this already in a way, as we jump into academic life, which the survey has been many things, Houdini has been in many places, we've never been in a university before, under the Bartlett, it's a generous sense of freedom, in a sense, in many ways, but I'm slightly worried by the sense that there may be so as it were, agenda and research questions which will be asked to look into the whole time, particularly architectural ones. And I at least, I can say this because I'm going, I would resist this too far. And the way I'd illustrate the benefits of the opposite approach is by what I call finding things under stairs, because the thing about the survey is it picks an area, it will have a reason for doing it, perhaps it's much under threat, or because the buildings of the kind in that area haven't been much researched. But you then find things you wouldn't actually have thought you were going to be dealing with, because you're obliged to deal with what is there, and it's stuff which people often haven't thought about. So, for instance, if you look at volume 48 on Woolwich, as you can expect, the picture down the bottom from the cover showing the famous barracks on the top of the common there, and the arsenal is in there. But what Peter Guillory did just as successfully, I think, in many ways very interestingly, was to map the effect which being a garrison town had on a kind of suburb of London in many ways, in a fascinating way, social way. So that mix of social and architectural agenda was most interesting, and in a way was kind of a byproduct of looking at the buildings. And I want to take 2 other similar examples also from recent volumes which address questions, which are very interesting questions, but which we didn't go into the area in order to try and answer in a very specific, organised way. One in Battersea, which you've just been hearing about, except for that wreck of a power station now being absurdly redeveloped with far too much housing around it, there is almost no remnant of a staggering amount of industry, which was all along the river front right away from basically, well, from Waterloo down to Wandsworth, wasn't it? And I think people forget how much industry there was. They forget that London was an industrial city for a start, and they certainly don't think that anywhere west of about London Bridge was industrial. But it was massively industrial and incredibly interesting. So I think this was mainly done by my colleague Colin Tom, who's now doing the Portland Place stuff. On Adam, very different kind of stuff. We have to be very general, very much generalists, to just a map and go into all the extraordinary things, very dirty and depressing and polluting. One reason the Battersea was very poor and not highly thought of until very recent years was the gigantic amounts of industry that was there. So that's a kind of service to the general history of London which we didn't go in to undertake, but came out of our work. That gas holder, as some of you will know, is just there by the skin of its teeth, but that's coming down pretty soon too. It's next to the power station. I'm going down into Senator, am I? Do I need to shout?
No, sorry, it's half gone now.
Half gone? It's half gone now, has it? Sorry, I thought you were talking about my voice. Not the gas holder is now half gone. I've been saying for a long time it was about to go, and now it seems to be going. And finally, this is the area we're on. Marylebone, posh, doctors, Harley Street, industry, you must be joking, but not at all. People would more or less know about the garment industry in the streets around Margaret Street, more famous for its church. And there on the left, you probably can't see it very well, the rather charming late arts and crafts building by an architect scholar who rather an endearing character called Martin Briggs, called Golden Brock House, which was very much a fashion, some little fashion house. And you'll see there's a big open salon, as it were, on the first floor, where models came and displayed the latest gear. That takes off just before the First World War in the most remarkable way, and has its heyday in the streets around Great Titchfield, Great Portland Street, which many of you will know, between about 1910 and 1960, and now has almost collapsed again. So that's been a fascinating thing, which we haven't quite finished yet. There are other ones almost more astonishing. Those of you know that wonderful book by Catherine Morrison and John Minnis called Carscapes may know that Great Portland Street was the centre of the West End car trade. That's where you bought your car if you had a smart car. And that's a very beautiful photograph which Peter Biller has just brought to life of girls making speedometers. And you may think they're in the fashion trade, but they're not. They're engraving speedometers in Great Portland Street. Of course, all that is totally gone as well. So these are things we find under stones and enjoy very much because they're the byproducts of the main, as it were, architectural problems, as it were. Right, just a few last things. I think one of the best things that's happened to the survey over the last 15 or so years is the integration of the photographs and the drawings together in the text, as it happens in nearly all scholarly books these days. I'm glad I nearly forgot to say that we are among the lucky people who are published by Yale University Press, who bring fantastically high standards of production. We're very grateful to them and Paul Mellon Centre for sponsoring the publication side. So that worry is taken off our hands. And as a result, we get better designed and very better looking books. There are problems, I think. It's too small to really see, but that's an open spread up the top right of an opening about 1930s department store in Woolwich. And I think sometimes the drawings and the photographs, they don't always give very well to each other when they're integrated. They somehow are a little bit in competition. I think that's a difficulty we haven't entirely solved. The great days when the measured drawings stood out in splendid isolation from the text are gone, because there are these wonderful photographs, like that one by Chris, you see of All Saints Margaret Street, which I hope will be in the forthcoming volume, on the left. And occasionally we're doing a bit of coloured drawing, and that was another church, I haven't shown you any churches so far, you've been lucky, not have them by the late George Wilson, beautiful watercolour of Butterfield decoration. So 2 bits of Butterfield there, and how can you illustrate Butterfield without having colour? Coloured is what we do. But I think there is a bit of a conceptual issue about how whether drawings and photographs don't fight against each other sometimes in architects. That I thought, well, how am I going to illustrate this? And I think the answer is to illustrate it without illustrating it. Well, we all want to know more. We can't write Georgian London like Summerson did, getting it all down in 230 pages. I don't know why we can't. We simply can't. We're greedy. We eat too much. Our hamburgers are too full of fatty food, and it's a problem which my successor probably be much better at solving than I am, because I'm a terrible not lever out of things. It's mea culpa on this one. Then there's this little problem which doesn't need emphasising. The reason the survey has moved so many times is because it's an expensive operation. There are 5 or 6 of us full-time, where you get very decent, honourable salaries. And since it's the time of the election campaign, I campaign at this point for more taxation, so the survey fund can be properly funded. And I'm sure you would all like more taxation for your own projects as well. So that's the answer. It's sort of silly systems. We have to go into the AHRC and plead for money and pretend we're got various research questions. And what are we doing that's new that nobody's ever been done before? You need solidarity and continuity. It can only be done by proper public institutions with proper taxation. Here endeth the lesson. Coming to the end. The future, well, we're going on to Whitechapel, and that is going to be very interesting indeed. A totally different thing. And indeed we have put in, because the Bartlett is very kind in paying our salaries, we can't pay for everything, for a project to the AHRC, which I've just abused, shouldn't do that, should I really, to try and see if they will help us create a kind of interactive database for investigating the multi-layered, complex history of that troubled and fascinating inner city area of Whitechapel, which has been through so many changes in immigration. So that will be a fantastic challenge for a volume which I imagine will come out at the end of this decade or thereabouts. The Marylebone projects are 2016, then we're going to do Oxford Street about 2018, then I think Whitechapel 19, and then I think probably Western Marylebone, the kind of Portland Square area, the Edgware Road, in about 2020. So they can't close us down, can they? They've got far too much to do. On which note, I thought I would just end with one of the great skeptics of British architecture and conservation, and the great historians, and also one of the great writers, of course. On his view, he was a great supporter of the survey. The survey, he said, will never be finished. If the time comes when a final coverage seems to be in sight, it will be time to begin again. London changes, so does the writing of history. The survey, as the continuing illustrator and expositor of the fabric of London, has a function with no imaginable term. And so, when King Ludwig II of Bavaria, in his swan boat, my swan song ends with the swan boat going on into the future. Thank you very much.
Lecture, which has certainly set a new benchmark for illustration of our lectures, I think.
No elegance before? No.
We now, as you know, open the floor to questions, and our usual custom is to collect them all and then for you to answer at the end. Are you happy with that as a record? Questions for Andrew? I'm sure there will be some. Let's start with
the officers with you. Thank you. Andrew, it was more of an observation. I just wanted to say, I think you do the survey an injustice when you say it doesn't have research aims. It does, of course, have research aims, and they're fundamental ones, it seems to me, which are what's there, what has been there, how has it come about, and why has it come about. And I hope that in future, what the survey and those who are responsible for it will be able to do is to develop the approach that you and your successors have had to be so successful, which is on the one hand to continue that fundamental inquiry and collation and collection of informed understanding of information, but on the other hand use the spin-offs to address the more specific research questions which will bring in, for example, HRC funding and bring in partnerships. So that I wouldn't say, I think you're underplaying the extent to which the survey is being research, modest underplaying the extent to which the survey is being research driven. But just to make the point that the mechanisms are there for the more focused, if you like, the more specific research questions to be framed for different public funding, research funding organisations.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I have one question or two parts, which maybe is very obvious, and I feel perhaps I'm asking like something so fundamental it's not worth asking. But you didn't mention personnel, you didn't mention the Public Monuments and Sculpture Association of Williams and London, perhaps because the Survey of London is doing something slightly different, but nevertheless they also clearly provide a very obvious base structure to look at.
Well, thank you very much for bringing up the Socialist Foundation as artist socialist organisation. I must admit, I must disagree with you over your statement that this cannot be done by the private sector. Come up to Hendon and see what we are doing in the Hendon District Archaeological Society, where we have set up a class with charges £230 a year, and it's oversubscribed, and we are writing up all our backlog of excavations. It can be done by local groups if they are properly organised. And I did want to get the impression that you have perhaps slightly lost your way. I know you're doing bits and pieces here, there and everywhere. I really want to ask the question, why do you think you should have public money when the public money could be better spent on the NHS?
While one hesitates to question the accuracy of what is in the Survey of London, if I were asked what was the most famous monument in St Olaf Hart Street, I would say it's that of Samuel Pepys, where they have an annual sermon. And I think it's it's one of the senior city livery companies and also Lammas work together to do a John Stowe sermon, but that's at St Andrew Undershaft, and I wonder whether the monument is actually the one in that church.
Two points, if I may, Andrew. Number one, do not be disheartened by the fact that people are not ringing up in response to emergencies and so on, such as the Battersea Arts Centre. I know from working in the world of building conservation and working on existing buildings that one of the reasons that very often you don't receive inquiries is because the volumes are being very intensively used by such people who are finding in those volumes almost everything they need to carry on their work, and so their lives and their practical experience is being enriched by that. So do not be disheartened. Point number two, I think there is a general question that there are six of you. You're actually the biggest team, really, you working on or conscious of the continuities in the story of London, and I sometimes think that it doesn't come over in the volumes about what kind of sense of place you're trying to develop and think about In other words, sometimes the parochial, the detailed, the antiquarian gets so much the upper hand that the reader, particularly the lay, non-professional reader, won't draw from a volume that sense of what kind of a place London is becoming.
I'd just like to ask a question which I've always wondered about, is whether now, what is the rationale for the choice of a particular, the next volume, and whether there's been any rationale for those in the past? On what basis are the areas chosen?
I'd like to point out that at the moment, Lauderdale House of Hiding, which was the subject of one of the earliest volumes in the 1930s, is in the process of being restored with money from the Heritage Lottery Fund and a lot of private funding. And the campaign to get it restored has been dependent on the Survey of London volume for two reasons. First of all, they're the architectural drawings, which have been invaluable in instructing the architects about the restoration features that are now lost. And the antiquarian information has provided the basis not only for a more recent history, but also for the sort of popular stories which can go in the local press and will help to generate further funds. So I think that in this respect, the Survey of London and the older volumes in particular have been tremendously useful at the present time.
Okay. I must start with my mistake. Yes, I'm a notoriously inaccurate scholar, and I apologise humbly for that. But it's my experience that people like mistakes, and so I don't apologise. Think of all those reviewers who've had fun pointing out other people's mistakes. So I'm reasonably relaxed about it, as long as there's only a small proportion among true facts. Well, now, in the classic way, we'll always remember the last person the best. But I'm very grateful to have the observation about Lauderdale House. It was encouraging to take that example, indeed, of one of the London Survey Committee volumes of the interwar period being so fantastically useful. And as Robert Thorne was saying, I think often we don't get to hear those kinds of inquiries because in a way the information is out there, so that's very gratifying. Thank you for making that comment. Now, a few things as they come to me. Selina Fox, you asked me about the choice of areas. It's very difficult, really, to be rational or honest, as it were, in the answer to that. I mean, to speaking in an entirely egotistic and personal way, I was delighted to come in 2006 at the moment we needed to choose a new area. So I thought, great, I can choose this, you know. And I think it's not quite the answer to your question, is the editorial autonomy, without there being a committee in charge, has been one of the best, most enjoyable reasons for working for the survey, not just for me, I think for everybody. And I think we try and balance that with behaving in a respectable way as a public service. The kind of accurate answer to your question is that yes, there's always, because some sense of need or degree of threat has been involved. Woodage, Crossrail was coming, Battersea, Nine Elms, all that redevelopment was occurring. Also we did the South London, because South London had been neglected for 50 years by the survey. So there's also a balance. A famous example of the survey being useful in a practical way is the Covent Garden volumes of the early 70s, which coincided with the huge pressure for the redevelopment of the market in the area and led to a lot of listings and to the Covent Garden we have today. So there is a kind of preservation agenda. There has been in the past. Whether that's been maintained, I don't know. That's, I think, as good as I can really answer. For instance, under Shepherd, there was a great threat on 18th century buildings in the West End, and so they went hammer and tongs at that for 20 years or so. So there's often been a preservation agenda, which of course would have been attributes. What else came up? Robert Thorne asked about the general agenda and the sense of London as a place. I think I would hope that the introductions to the volumes have got a bit better over the last 20 years or 30 years, which is quite a short time for the survey. I think they probably are kind of more generally intelligible. What they don't do, I quite agree with, is say what's London become now. I'm struggling with the Marylebone introduction at the moment. Am I going to talk a lot about the kind of any great detail about the changes in streets like Harley Street? I probably ought to. So I think probably one of the, even the many practical reasons, the survey hasn't been done doing those kind of things quite so well as it should be. It's done at the end, and there's something of a rush about it often, and it's a point that's well taken. Thank you for making it. The Pevsners, the public sculpture, sorry if I didn't mention those, it's certainly not for lack of respect, and I know Simon Bradley's in the room. We feed off them, of course, in the early stages, just like they feed off us, and that's a very terrific relationship. I guess we enjoy our ability not just to talk about architecture, and that's the critical difference. But there's no rivalry, I think, and it's a satisfactory relationship. We don't expect people to go. It's difficult enough to lug around the Pevsners now that you had. Imagine lugging around the survey, you just can't do it. So those, I think, were the main points that came up. Gentleman said the survey is arrogant. He didn't use the word arrogant, he was too kind to do that, and thinking that we're the only people who can do things in that amount of detail. It can be done locally. I do actually absolutely 100% accept that the level of local history and archaeology in London, I couldn't speak about it, is of an immensely high standard. When we were working on Battersea, for instance, what was being done by the Wandsworth Historical Society and the Clapham Society was of an absolutely fantastically high standard, and we were hugely grateful for that. So you're right to correct me on that. I'd be pretty nervous about the idea of the public funds being reduced even further, but we're actually technically not on public money anymore. We're on university money, but how much the government's going to go on contributing to that, you all can have other meetings to discuss. But of course, I think it should be continued. I think those are the main points.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, on behalf of us all, I'd like to thank you very much for speaking to us this evening, Andrew. I think there's many things to admire about this project. The sheer breadth of the ambition and scale of the project and its very longevity, I think, give rise to admiration. And it's been fascinating to learn how the history of the project has reflected changing attitudes to heritage over the 120 years, and to see how the survey has managed to reinvent itself on a number of occasions to answer changing shifts in understanding what matters and what's important in the heritage. And clearly why it is still valued so much is the meticulous research that's been done. And I entirely echo what Chris Scull has said. I think what you've shown very eloquently is what I've long believed, is that good research is often very ill-served by being boxed in by questions. I think what's also very interesting is that the survey has not only appealed to the profession and informed views on what's important on protection, planning and so forth, but that early genesis it had in a sort of moral and humanitarian aspect, I think is very interesting in that it's clearly also appeals to a public. And I read somewhere when I was looking at the background of the survey that I think online the survey gets almost as many hits as it's only OS maps that get more hits. So clearly, this really does appeal and has a significance to a really wide audience, and I think that's a real achievement for something which has its origins in something antiquarian. And I think for our society, this sets a great example, because it's what we're about. We're about excellence in conservation and research, but also in making those results very publicly accessible and valuable across a much wider public. So thank you very much indeed for a really very, very interesting and informative evening.